generations. And the first place I heard about conservation easements was from you, and in your push back on the 30 by 30 plan. And so I reached out to you and thought we needed to kind of put some, or just kind of just go through over, like, I don't want this to be all about what they were talking about, but just go over conservation easements and make sure maybe there's an alternative view out there. And so people really know, like, the kind of they talked a lot about the benefits, but, talk about the downside of what you're actually signing on to. And so, can you just kind of explain what a conservation easement is?
Yeah, so a conservation easement is, well, it's a device that the environmentalists created years ago. And one of the first documents that we read on it, the discussion for creating these was that they knew that in order to control private property, they would never have enough money to actually go out and buy it. Therefore, one of the things they came up with was this conservation easement. It would give them the ability to control property, but they wouldn't have to actually purchase the entire property, but they still have the same functional control. So that was the genesis of a conservation easement. Another key thing they did was they named it conservation easement, when actually, as the device in law that it actually fits is something called a conservation servitude. The reason is because once that conservation easement is placed on the landowner becomes the servient estate. They're no longer the primary entity controlling that land. So it's known as a conservation servitude. Again, they knew if they called them conservation servitudes, many landowners would immediately back away because they would understand what that meant. But calling it a conservation easement, it kind of puts in, I think, landowners' minds, oh, this is like a road easement, or it's, something nice and useful. And, we're familiar with road easements. That doesn't control the entire property, but a conservation easement does. So it's different. It should never have been named that, but that was a deliberate decision they made in order to get more of these put in place. So what the conservation easement does is you are selling the development rights to a land trust or the government. And so, and then this is authorized under the IRS tax code. So ultimately, what you have to understand about a conservation easement is ultimately, it doesn't matter who's holding that easement, the IRS is the enforcer of that easement. So it's that tax code that requires that for you to get the tax deduction, the tax benefit, either through income tax or through an estate tax, which applies to the first generation that holds the easement, then there's certain things that the easement has to do. It cannot have any mining on it. The conservation purpose must be for a legitimate conservation purpose, meaning things like protecting species. And we heard on the podcast, he talked about the one easement in California that was protecting the salamander and Save the Ranch. So there's always a conservation purpose with these. That conservation purpose controls the property, every bit of that property. So it doesn't really, you have a contract, the landowner signs a contract which is basically the baseline. They write in everything you're doing on that land today. And that you can continue doing. You have to write everything in there that you want. But then you also heard them talk about the building envelopes. They also, in that contract, have to write out if they ever want to build another house on that property in the future. And remember, the conservation easement is signed in perpetuity. That's a requirement of the IRS tax code. So they're not making the decision for how many houses they want to build on that property. Like if they have a couple kids that may want to come back and, build a house next to them. They're making that decision for every generation going forward. So think 200, 300, 500, 1,000 years from now, they're making that decision on that piece of land, whether or not those people can build another house. So that's, that's a part I think that people don't really understand. No, if you're in agriculture, you know that you're doing really well to predict what's going to happen this year. Really,
Right.
it's a volatile industry. That's the nature of it. And so to sign these kind of contracts and limit your ability and future generations' ability on what you can do on the land, is very troubling. Is certainly something that I think people need to think twice about. But another key component of this is the easement itself is you have to understand there's a number of restrictions placed on that land, but they only apply to the landowner.
Right.
So the landowner is the one who's agreeing to all these restrictions. The land trust is given the ability to manage, oversee the land, enforce, and actually the federal government to enforce that this conservation purpose is carried out on the land, whatever that is.
Yeah.